So I'm going to talk about a joint project where we look at the linkages between climate change, internal migration, and depopulation trends. And as Erich has said, we are using evidence from a novel database that we derive from global census data. This is joint work with my colleagues Abel and Raya Muttarak, as well as two co-authors from Bocconi University, Maurizio Malpede and Marco Percoco. All what I will be presenting to you today is still work in progress, so we very much welcome any feedback that you might have or any suggestions. Also today I will be presenting you findings from a first study that we have been doing, where we look in particular at the role of aridification and desertification trends and how they affect internal migration patterns worldwide. In many regions of the world, we see already today that changes in environmental and climatic conditions are linked to migration dynamics and other forms of human mobility. The strength and the direction of the relationship, however, depends very much on local conditions and the type and intensity of the experienced environmental influences. So we see quite a substantive heterogeneity in the way how populations respond to environmental stresses in terms of their migration behavior. Here in this study, as I said, we are looking into the impact of gradual aridification and desertification processes on internal migration flows worldwide. We're using a novel data source on bilateral internal migration flows that is based on harmonized IPM's international census data for 68 countries. And what is special about our study is that we're not only looking into the relationships of environmental hazards and environmental change processes and migration, but we're also able with our data to explore mechanisms and differences across contexts that help us to better understand not only how many people will migrate due to climatic changes, but also who migrates, under which conditions, and to which locations. Our approach is very closely related to work by Garcia et al. From 2015, who have modeled internal migration flows in sub-Saharan Africa, also using the IPROM's microdata series. Already today, we see in large parts of the world quite high levels of aridity and high temporal and spatial rainfall variability. So-called drylands, that is regions with a heightened level of aridity. Drylands already today comprise more than 40% of the global terrestrial area, as you can see here on the left-hand side in a map from the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land. And they are home to around 3 billion people, or 1/3 of the total global population. With climate change, these areas, or climate change is expected to further increase aridity in many regions of the world and may potentially also contribute to a further expansion of drylands, of course, together with human factors that drive, for example, land degradation. Taken together, increased aridity and land degradation can have severe socioeconomic impacts, for example, on food security, poverty, and biodiversity, which in turn can all affect mobility outcomes. And here in this study, we're interested in understanding these linkages. We use data from IPM's International as primary data source. For those of you who are not familiar with this data, IPM stands for Integrated Public Use Microdata Series, and it's a platform that provides harmonized census data from all over the world for more than 100 countries worldwide, dating back to the 1950s. Based on this data, we construct our migration measure using information on the subnational region of residence of the census respondents today, which we combine with information about the region of residence of the census respondents 1 or 5 years ago. So in many of the censuses that are available in IPM's International, both information are available, the current region of residence of the census respondents, as well as the previous region of residence if they have migrated. And based on this information, we construct a migration measure that calculates the migration flow from a subnational region A to another subnational region B in the past 1 or 5 years. And we do this for all countries that we have included in the data. So the unit of analysis that we're considering in our studies are the GEO1 subnational census regions over time that are basically available in the censuses. And we combine complement the migration information with climate data on desertification and aridification trends using data from the CGIAR, the Copernicus program, and the climate research unit of the University of East Anglia. To give you a better idea of the data we are using, I have plotted here the subnational census G1 census regions that we use as the basis for our analysis. So for each of these regions that you see here, we have information on outmigration of people to other regions within the same country. In total, we have data for 68 countries that we derived from 188 different censuses. This gives us a time series for some countries that dates back to the 1960s and covers data up to 2050. In total, we calculate 98,000 bilateral flows with this data. That is flows that go between one region A to another region B and vice versa. How does that look in practice? I have brought you here an example from China, where you can see that with our data, we can calculate how many people have migrated from a region A to another region B and vice versa. And we can also calculate how many people have migrated from a region C to another region D and vice versa. So it's quite a rich data set over time that allows us to determine to what extent environmental conditions have shaped changes in migration outcomes in these regions over time. For this, we combine the information on the migration with information on changes in the environmental conditions in these regions. As I said, primarily for the first study, we focus on aridification. Here you see changes in aridity in percent across the different regions in our data for the period 1950 to 2010. And you see that there have been quite some differences over the different areas that we consider, with aridification taking particular place in regions of Africa, for example, but also in East Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as in some selected regions in North and Latin America. As a main outcome, we're looking at the annual outmigration rate from a region to other regions. As measures for aridification in our models, we're looking at 3 different indicators that all basically stand for the dryness conditions in a region. First, we look at the aridity index in an area. Then as a second measure, we look at the normalized density vegetation index. And as a third measure, the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index. And all of these measures, they are averaged over 10 years and all reflect dryness conditions in a region. One particularity about these measures is that they are all negatively coded. That is, lower values indicate a higher level of dryness. That is, if we observe later in our results a negative impact of these measures on migration, then this means that higher dryness is related with actually more outmigration. So that's just for you to be kept in mind. Using these measures, we estimate Poisson fixed effects models where we regress the annual outmigration rate on the dryness, the climatic conditions in origin and destination regions in the past 10 years, while controlling for further census-specific controls, as well as origin, destination region, and time period fixed effects to control for unobserved heterogeneity and common time trends that might otherwise affect our results. Here you see the main findings of our baseline models, where we have regressed the annual outmigration rate on these different measures reflecting the dryness conditions in the regions. And to summarize the findings from this table, we see significant and sizable effects of aridification on outmigration across the regions considered in our sample. One standard deviation increase in aridity, for example, in a region is estimated to lead to a 14.6 increase in the outmigration rate. So quite some substantive effects here. As a next step, we have looked into differences in the relationship between changes in environmental conditions and migration across different regions, as well as across the level of aridity, the baseline level of aridity in the different regions in our sample. And here we find that it's particularly regions in Africa, as well as in East Asia and the Pacific and North America, where we see the strongest relationship between aridification and outmigration. And furthermore, it is in particular those regions that are already characterized by very dry conditions, where we see that on an extra and additional drying has a particularly strong impact on migration. So regions that are already characterized by a high level of aridity, they see the strongest migration responses. We have then used these different models to derive predictions for different world regions based on the location of the regions and also the baseline aridity level. And here you can see some interesting results. That in a first insight is that there is quite some substantive heterogeneity across the world. When you look at the relationship between aridification and migration. So what you see here is plotted the marginal effects of our models shown for the different regions in our data. So there is quite some substantive heterogeneity, but we also see strong effects that are highlighted here in darker red for regions in Africa and Southeast Asia and East Asia, but also in regions in North America, we see an increased migration pressure with heightened aridification in these areas. As a final step, we have distinguished our migration data by different characteristics of the migrants, distinguishing these individual migration flows between the regions by for different migration groups. And here, as a last finding, we see that it is particularly the migration of people with a lower education that is affected by aridification processes, as well as of population groups that are out of the labor force. So it's particularly the elderly, as well as very young people who are found to
2 minutes.
Thank you, Eric, thank you. That are found to change their migration behavior as a response to changes in environmental conditions. And now in the next steps of this project, we are trying to understand better what the underlying processes are that are driving these effects, also looking into multidimensional migration characteristics, also by sex and other characteristics of the migrants. To summarize, I've shown you a study on the impacts of aridification as a gradual environmental change process on internal migration using a novel global data source on bilateral internal migration flows. We find quite meaningful migration impacts, but also considerable differences across regions depending on different environmental and socioeconomic conditions. So there is quite some heterogeneity also in our findings. And to mention it, of course, our study adds, we believe, some interesting insights, but it also has a number of limitations that are mostly related to the migration measure that we use, that, for example, does not account for circular migration or short-term migration flows. But nevertheless, we think that our study adds very important insights and comparative evidence on environmental migration processes and their implications for depopulation worldwide. And with this, I would like to stop here. And I thank you very much for your attention, and we're looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.